Somebody.
Yeah, no, it's perfect.
Yeah. You see all these notes I've got here?
All right, we can get started right away.
War we reading?
Switch the phones off.
Call me back, Mom. No, no.
Well, good morning. Welcome, everyone. I guess the air conditioning is working, so that's nice.
They're going to start right at 11. C-SPAN's not covering. Wait till 11. Oh, now, boom, now we're good. Now we're on.
Well, we go again. Well, welcome, everyone. The air conditioning is still working. It's good to be here today. A very timely topic. The Trump strategy with Iran, maximum pressure. Is it working? Is it just a stagnant situation? For those who follow Iran closely, as we do, for those who follow the situation in the Gulf, you might have noticed there isn't 1 week where we wake up and there isn't a big incident, a big escalation happening in the region. Since May 12, we have seen more than a dozen incidents in the Gulf targeting tankers and threatening the freedom of navigation. U.S.-Iranian escalation has just continued. Zarif was sanctioned last month, and Iran increased its enrichment of uranium. In Iraq, we have seen 4 explosions in 2 months targeting the PMF militia, pro-Iran militia. The last one was yesterday.
They want you to use the mic. Sorry.
In Yemen, In Yemen, just this morning, the U.S. confirmed that one of its drones were shut down. This is the second also incident in Yemen since June. So with me to discuss all of this is a very diverse group of experts, and all of them actually I would call friends. I'm gonna start from the far left with Behnam. He's Behnam Ben Taleblu. I hope I said it right. He's a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. To his right is Brian Katulis, senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. To his right is Fatima al-Asrar. She follows Yemen very closely and is a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Institute. And to my left is Mike Pregent, a senior fellow here at the Hudson Institute. Thank you for hosting us. Thank you for our C-SPAN audience following this, to those who are following us on Twitter as well. How we're gonna do this is we're gonna start off by very short opening statements on the quote unquote maximum pressure strategy. Is it working? What has changed in the region? And then we're gonna have discussion amongst us, and we'll turn to you for questions afterwards. So Mike, why don't I start with you? It's been now over a year since the U.S. withdrew from the nuclear agreement. The maximum pressure strategy, sanctions on almost everything that's connected to the Iranian regime. Has it worked?
I believe it's working, and thanks for doing this on such short notice. Thanks for being here. Thank you all for coming today as well. I believe the maximum pressure campaign is working despite Iran's provocations in an attempt to get Europe to cave and to find bypass mechanisms to skirt U.S. sanctions. So it is working, but I'll tell you what's not working. I believe this is what war with Iran looks like. Everybody's caught up in this narrative that war with Iran is an invasion of Iran with 100,000 American troops. That's not what war with Iran looks like. This is what war with Iran looks like. And what we're seeing is there are very few successful attacks. There are some attacks on oil tankers. There are some rocket and missile launches by certain proxies in the Levant. But there's this air campaign, and what the Iraqi militias and other militias tied to Qasem Soleimani are realizing is that Qasem Soleimani cannot protect them. We have 4 explosions in Iraq in the last 30 days against ammunition depots. One happened yesterday. Ammunition depots that are controlled by Iran-backed militias. and they're being attacked without consequence. We've seen the Israeli Air Force attack Qasem Soleimani proxies and offensive capabilities in static missile storage sites and rocket storage sites in Syria without consequence. 6-hour air campaigns where Russia sits on its hands. They don't use the S-300s, they don't use the S-400s to protect Qasem Soleimani's operations. And we're seeing provocations by Iran that really aren't working. And if you look at the increased capability that the US and other allies have put in the Strait of Hormuz, we now have an intelligence, reconnaissance, and surveillance capability that actually can show the international community when Iran tries to seize something. Now, the British tanker is probably the last successful operation Iran's going to be able to conduct in the Strait if we do this right. So what I'm getting to here is Iran is now resorting to going after tankers that are actually involved in its illegal smuggling operation. The Iraqi tanker that was seized 10 days ago is theirs. And they seized it to be able to show that it was cheating because they knew it was cheating because it's theirs. That's where they're at. It's fun to watch. I think as an international body, we can literally absorb these attacks and continue to put sanctions on because this is what war with Iran looks like. They cannot do a lot. And at the end of the day, with regards to the JCPOA, Russia and China are not interested in the Islamic Republic violating the NPT, the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty. The JCPOA kind of wasn't necessary in a lot of ways. The NPT was already there. The JCPOA was designed to stimulate Iran's economy, to get it to take more of a share in the Middle East. It somehow aligned with US interests to balance that Saudi-Iran competition in the Middle East that we just haven't seen play out at all. I'll stop there. This is what war with Iran looks like, and it's fun to watch.
I do have a lot of follow-up questions, mainly on deterrence. You know, the deployments actually in the Gulf, the US, British, have not deterred Iran, so we will get to that in the discussion also on the JCPOA. But why don't we move to Fatima, if you can give us some insight on, you know, when you look at Yemen, when the drone incident today, the second, how has this maximum pressure been you know, seen inside Yemen? What is Iran doing differently?
Thanks, Joyce, and thanks to the Hudson Institute for having me here. In terms of Yemen, I think the Houthi rebels of Yemen have become Iran's favorite proxy. So, of course, in Iraq or in Lebanon, the Iran-backed militias cannot take action because they would risk direct confrontation with US forces in the region. But in Yemen, because of the ongoing conflict, it has become very easy for Iran to use the Houthis to destabilize the Gulf, to send a message to the United States while hiding behind plausible deniability, saying that it has really no relations with the Houthi communities, and it's basically a complete lie because the Houthis have gotten all of their capabilities from the drones, from the ballistic missiles, through the IRGC. So within Yemen, it is preventing the Yemeni people from coming to peace. The US has thrown all of its efforts into mediation efforts in Yemen. So it's backing the UN political process. It's backing the UN envoy, Martin Griffiths. But we are consistently coming into just you know, it's not going anywhere because Iran keeps on telling the Houthis to escalate, you know, at a time where it's against its best interest to escalate. So even, for example, if we look at the port of Hodeidah in Yemen, where the Arab coalition was going to move in and try to reclaim the port, which was basically would help in terms of elevating the humanitarian crisis. But there was pushback there, as in, you know, any type of military confrontation in the military of Hodeidah could have escalated the crisis. The Houthis have allegedly stated that they would be able to withdraw, But the day after they withdrawn, they've launched an attack, the first attack on Abhaz airport in Saudi Arabia. So
you would say that the Houthis feel more empowered
they-
now in Yemen?
the Houthis have constantly been empowered by the Iranian regime, and they're standing alone in Yemen. They don't have any allies. So the only ally that they're looking for is the Islamic Republic. And the relationship with the Islamic Republic is slowly coming to the surface. Just last week, the Houthis appointed an ambassador to Tehran. It's an illegitimate government, but Tehran is seeking to provoke that way. So, and this is just an Iranian tactic that we're used to. So Iranian does all of these things that we're often busy trying to interpret, and it basically advances its own expansionist interests, and unfortunately, it uses these militias despite any cost that it has at home. So the Houthis have been very brutal in the way that they've governed inside of Yemen. There have been over 8,000 political prisoners in Yemen, and they're detained by the Houthis, and we hear nothing about that in the news. And of course, the Houthis are using this to their advantage, and Iran is using this to its advantage. In the same way, the Houthis have, news such as the killing of or the death sentence for 30 journalists who are among the Houthis have not even generated any type of attention. So they clamp down. And they sort of follow an Iranian-like strategy in terms of clamping down on domestic opposition, but then they pursue the destabilizing effects on the region, on the neighbors, whom Yemenis have always had strong ties with.
Okay. Brian, why don't you give us your unfiltered thoughts on your approach, your assessment of the maximum pressure strategy that the administration has employed. Is it working? Where do you see things going from a U.S. perspective?
Sure, thanks. First, thanks for all of you for coming and watching in August. It's summer. You should be at the beach. But I'm honored. We're honored. And this is an important discussion. Thanks to Mike and Hudson for having me here. I have a different view from Mike. We talk about this a lot. And discussions like this that include different views are actually rarer these days in town. So hopefully, if you disagree with me, and I hope you do, we'll do it respectfully, the way that Mike and I do. Philadelphia Eagles, Dallas Cowboys. This guy's he's wearing a Redskins tie match. Amazing.
Basically 2 victories for each of us every year.
But not to make light of the issues. Our differences are important. Our differences are about war and peace, about lives. But we're also human beings and want to sort of share our expertise. So thanks to Hudson for doing this, because quite often you don't have people from different persuasions. The second thing, before I answer your question, is when I talk about Iran, I've never been to Iran. I talk to a lot of Iranians. I think one thing that's often missing in Washington, D.C. think tank panels is the Iranian perspective, the multitude of Iranian perspectives. My friend here will give us a little bit, he's American, but
from New York.
From New York, though. But there's a range of perspectives. And the point I want to make is, I think, a simple one, but I think an important one. When we talk about Iran, we often think of it as some sort of piece in the chessboard, and we're going to exercise policy tools against it. It's a country with people. And just a few blocks from here, there's an amazing exhibit at the Sackler Gallery. I went with a couple of colleagues yesterday at lunch. My Iran, 6 women photographers. Go. Not that this will give you sort of the full appreciation of what a complex society like Iran is and the people are, but go and look at these photos. There's a quote there from one of the photographers, Nusha Tavakolian. And then I'm going to get into my, but it's important, I think, because this voice, the complex sort of diverse views from within Iran aren't often represented. She writes about these photos. These images will not change anything, nor will they help anybody. What I hope is that they visualize a generation marginalized by those speaking in their name. By those speaking in their name. So I just offer that with a sense of humility as an analyst who just looks at US foreign policy, who talks to Iranians in academic exchanges, who goes to the Middle East all of the time. There's a limitation in what I have to say, and one of those limitations is that I haven't actually explored the full depths of what Iran is, and it's a country with people. My main response to your question, Joyce, is no. The strategy is not working. This is where Mike and I disagree. I think it's a disaster. My friendly amendment to the title here of this panel, which is Trump's Maximum Pressure Campaign, Rally, Allies, and Rattle Iran. My friendly amendment, this is what I would change. I meant to tell you this on the phone the other day. Trump's aggressive appeasement, confuse allies, attack each other. Trump's aggressive appeasement of Iran, confuse our allies, and let's just attack each other, because increasingly our debates on foreign policy are about dividing ourselves. Aggressive appeasement.
Right.
Aggressive. What do I mean by that? We have a president who, as we see every day, uses rhetoric with effect. No lie. On the way here to the panel, I got a call from a Danish journalist. Anyone want to guess what he was asking me about? Greenland. People take the words of the President of the United States to this day very seriously. That's all I'm going to say about that topic. This is a president on Iran. If it's Monday, Wednesday, or Friday, he says one thing. If it's Tuesday, Thursday, he or his team saying something else. But it's often quite aggressive, reminiscent of that phase earlier on in North Korea policy, if you want to call it a policy, of fire and fury. But policy isn't just statements, it's actions. After years of trying to pull US troops back from the region and rebalance to where we were in the 80s and 90s, we're sending more troops to the region. And just 2 months ago about...
More troops where?
To the Middle East, to Saudi Arabia, to other places.
You mean to air bases?
Yeah, to air bases and things like that.
To protect against.
Yeah, let's be clear. We're not talking about Syria, where the actual fight against some of these forces in Iran are. And there, but for the grace of Tucker Carlson, I think 2 months ago, phoning the President of the United States, we may have had some sort of military action. And Mike says we're already at war, and I think you said it's fun to watch. Again, respectfully, I disagree. I think war is never fun to watch. And I would say also, if in fact, and it's a good point to debate, if we are in fact at war, we should tell our Congress and the American people about it. They need to have a voice in that, and the authorizations for the use of force when we send our most precious national security assets into harm's way. They need actually the support of a democratic society. We are living right now, and thank you again for coming in the summer, in a phase and in a haze where most of the American public just ain't tracking this. And it's a dangerous precipice that we're on because it's a complicated situation, which we'll agree. Close off here. Aggressive appeasement. Why appeasement? Again, if you look at Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's speech from last year where he had 12 requirements, which he called very basic about what he would like to see in Iran. To me, as an analyst who's been in this game for a while, it reminded me of those benchmarks that members of Congress wrote about Iraq about 10, 12 years ago. Sort of a wish list, a platonic ideal of where we would like to be from Secretary Pompeo's perspective. Yesterday, he spoke at the UN as well. He asserted that the policy, like Mike has asserted, is working. Pro tip here. When a US official actually has to repeatedly say the policy is working, he's actually arguing against a basic set of facts and realities that people don't believe. And that may be a function of sort of our policy environment or political environment. But again, aggressive appeasement in the sense that if you look at the Middle East as I see it, I don't see us any closer to an equilibrium. I don't see Iran, though hurt by these sanctions. Let's be clear, maximum pressure is having an impact on the people of Iran. Not sure it's having an impact in a strategic way yet on the calculus of the leaders, but it's having an impact, and this is where I'll close, is that I think in this environment, the way I look at the Trump team itself, because this is where the center of gravity is. There's a whole other discussion about our politics of Iran and national security that I think is worth having. But inside the Trump team, I see a lot of division from the top on down. It was easy to get everybody on board to impose costs on Iran, to impose maximum pressure. I don't see any glimmer of a strategy of what's next. As a policy analyst, that's what concerns me, wherever you stand sort of on the positions. I was a guy in favor of the JCPOA and thought it could be improved in a better way than the Trump administration has done. I'm a guy who thinks that Iran does things that destabilize the region. Guess what? Some of our closest partners do as well. That we would be better advised to use our tools of statecraft in a better approach than what we've seen under Trump. I think we're actually in a weaker position. We're more isolated in the world. We have some of our closest allies not backing us. And we have this thin veneer of Trump rhetoric plus some troop movements that could get us into some sticky situations, but the absence of an actual coherent strategy.
Okay, a lot to follow up on as well. Behnam, the only Iranian American on the
burden
panel.
to carry.
No.
It's all on you, man.
You follow what's happening inside Iran. You follow every drone attack that happens in the region, every missile that flies off, from Yemen to Saudi. Where do you see things? What's your take on what you've heard so far? And is there a strategy when you look at it, and is it working?
That's the strategy.
He gets entrance music.
It's the
like a WWE wrestler.
Hopefully it won't be fake, though. Thank you, Joyce, for that question. And also thanks to Hudson and Mike for hosting, and the co-panelists for sharing the stage with me today, and to you guys for turning out. You make it sound like a very interesting life, Joyce, tracking flying tubes all the time. But it can get a little redundant, but I'm intentionally using the word redundant because, just to briefly follow off of what Brian here was saying, what the strategy is going to be is more of the same. We're going to see more of the same, and you see it in the news cycle, you see it in the Iranian method of escalation, you see it in the American response, and you see it in the tit for tat. We're reaching a new normal, and it's really been the summer of escalation. And as we move towards some more political highlights, the G7, the UNGA, Iran's own self-imposed deadlines to continue to exceed and violate the limits imposed on its nuclear program by the JCPOA nuclear deal. We're locking in positions. And I think what you're seeing is a very public negotiation. And I have thoughts on what the Americans are saying publicly about their position, and I have thoughts about what the Iranians are saying publicly. But let me just rephrase that and say how we got here. The max pressure campaign, you can say, really started in earnest when Washington left the Iran deal last May. It actually left it on May 8th, a few days short of a deadline to extend a waiver for more sanctions relief. And then Washington began to incrementally, in 2 phases, reimpose the sanctions that were once waived by the JCPOA nuclear deal. I found that to be a very incremental, graduated, responsible strategy for escalation. However, really, since then, Washington has ramped up the pressure. And Iran's response to that, it wasn't really said publicly, but you saw it in the behavior. You know, this is a classic academic Tom Schelling talking about communication through deed and not by word. So we're learning about how Iran is communicating with their deeds. The deeds Iran engaged in the first year was really, you could kind of frame it as strategic patience. In fact, I kind of have this dream or this vision that Khamenei is sitting and the Supreme National Security Council is sitting, and there is this Quranic injunction, I think, that best defines Iran's response to the first year of max pressure, May 2018 to May 2019, with an obvious couple exceptions. And the Quranic injunction is Inna Allah ma sabirin, which means, verily, God is with the patient. Under the first year of max pressure, the Iranian strategy was to wait out the Trump administration, to choose not to do things that would drive the Europeans toward the Americans, to choose to do things that would keep the transatlantic community apart, that would keep the UN Security Council community divided, that would make America look more isolated, and that would not put Iran in formal violation of the deal. They would live in the gray zone, they would continue to cultivate ambiguity, but not do things to warrant or invite a response. Thinking, like actually most of Washington thought, that American unilateral sanctions could not accomplish sufficient damage to the macroeconomy of Iran when it took multilateral sanctions almost a decade to do that. Fast forward 1 year, I think the conventional wisdom in most of Washington and the conventional wisdom, I think, of most of the regime elites in Iran is wrong. American unilateral sanctions by the same standards of the macroeconomy, oil exports, GDP, inflation. You currently have stagflation in Iran. Value of the rial on the black market relative to the US dollar. By all those indicators, max pressure is a success. And I think it's by all those indicators that Iranian decision makers came together and decided to amend their strategy of strategic patience and engage in graduated escalation. Now, I think Fatima was talking about Yemen and how the Iranians feel safe and confident that they can actually engage in Yemen and engage in escalation in Yemen. I would largely agree with that, because in that first year of strategic patience, what you saw the Iranians do was, when you had their partners or their proxies or their allies across the region engage in escalation, meaning take a new territory, use a new weapon, choose a new target, they did so because of battlefield conditions. Likely not because Soleimani was calling them, but because the battlefield necessitated that they escalate and they do this. What you've really seen since the spring of 2019 is the opposite. There is the political directive to escalate. There is Soleimani likely calling, or Tehran likely saying, please do this, which explains why you see militias, proxies, partners do things that don't necessarily make operational sense, that don't yield military dividends for the proxy militia partner, but actually yield political dividends for Tehran because they can be interpreted as a signal of resolve against Washington. So I don't remember the full second.
Spring of 2019, just to be specific, it is when the U.S. sanctioned, designated the IRGC.
Exactly, April 2019.
The oil sanctions,
the revocation of the oil waivers, and approaching the 1-year anniversary of the withdrawal of the JCPOA. Exactly. And so it's in response to these forces that I think Iran is trying to communicate with Washington, to say that we're not going to take this lying down, and that ultimately, because they know that the strategy is driven primarily by sanctions, meaning coercive economic measures, Iran is going to need sanctions relief at some point. And all these moves, in my view, is actually a measure of success of max pressure. It may sound perverse to say, but if you take, with respect, the Polaroid approach that Brian is taking, where it's a snapshot, yeah, it looks pretty bad. Looks like the Iranians are testing more missiles now than before. The militias are escalating more than before. Well, that's because there was no policy rhetorically and economically to counter those things before. If we're going to talk about an absence of policy, I think there's a bipartisan foreign policy failure to push back on Iran really since the JCPOA. The success of max pressure is clearly in the macroeconomy of Iran by those indicators. The shortcomings still are diplomatic, meaning we still have this divergence with our allies. Today there's news, however, that Australia is going to be joining that maritime policing coalition in the Persian Gulf, Strait of Hormuz and Gulf of Oman. That's a small win, that's a good win. But it still has diplomatic setbacks, like the issue with a tanker in Gibraltar. But then sometimes those setbacks are corrected, with Greece refusing entry to some of its ports of that tanker that was released by Gibraltar a few days ago. So it needs a diplomatic win, and it needs a regional win.
At the same time, and my question to the panel, maybe I start with you, Mike, is you don't see, if the point of sending warships, aircraft carriers to the Gulf is to deter Iran, the attacks have only increased. So when you talk about deterrence, when you talk about very close Gulf allies who now have to, watch over their back, their ports are threatened. Right. How could you say that the strategy is working, since Iran is not deterred, has not come to the table to talk to the U.S. administration?
So I'm speaking as a veteran of 3 wars. I know what a deployment to Afghanistan looks like. I know what a deployment to Iraq looks like. We have put in a defensive capability in the Middle East to absorb these attacks. We put in air defense systems in Iraq, in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, to protect our allies, to protect the American advise and assist effort. That's what I mean by this is what war with Iran looks like, and it'll be fun to watch, because at the end of the day, it's a conventional military that can't project. It is a special forces intelligence hybrid that is capable, and the Quds Force. But its Iraqi militias are afraid. They're getting hit, and they're not attacking Americans like they said they would. They've made these threats to attack Americans at the Balad Air Base, and intelligence showed an increased capability, and all of a sudden that arms depot was destroyed in an air attack. So what I'm saying is we put in a defensive capability to absorb and an offensive capability to respond. And we haven't responded yet. And I don't think the Tulsi Gabbard, Tucker Carlson influence on the president has anything to do with this non-attack that the president didn't conduct against Iran after shooting down the drone. What happened was we demonstrated a capability. The IRGC operators at those radar sites saw an imminent American attack, and then it stopped. It was followed with a cyber attack that shut down those radar screens and left those IRGC operators vulnerable for 30 minutes, believing they were going to die. That led to the president saying, I could have killed 150 IRGC guys last night. I chose not to. That is the equivalent of somebody filming you while you're sleeping in your bedroom and sending you the VHS tape the next day and saying, I could have killed you last night, but I chose not to. That's effective. That is something that was the right way to intimidate a paper tiger in a lot of ways. So that's what I'm talking about. The technology has caught up with the Islamic Republic. We can now show in real time the IRGC trying to seize a oil tanker in international waters. We can show that to the international community. However, Iran maintains I got to just talk. I was the only one that went with the 2 minutes initially.
We did Middle Eastern way.
Roger, yeah. So I'll just wrap up. Iran has an offensive cyber capability that is on par with where technology is right now. We have an offensive capability as well. We've done that a couple times. We've dropped drones from the sky with a cyber attack. We shut down radar sites with a cyber attack. That is something the Obama administration wasn't comfortable doing, and it was something in the JCPOA as part of these secret negotiations where we assured the Iranian government, the Islamic Republic, that we wouldn't do something like this. So that's what I mean by this is what war looks like with Iran, and it'll be fun to watch because we're seeing desperation. However, the Houthis are the most powerful tool the Iranians have now. The Iraqi militias are afraid. They're sitting on their hands. They're not doing anything. They're getting killed in Syria.
They have fired few missiles on. They didn't.
Yeah, I know, but during the
no
Iraq War,
casualties.
we would be going to go eat something, and there'd be a rocket strike, and we would just feel delayed. Like, oh, we can't go eat now. We got to stay in this bunker for about 2 minutes. They're not accurate fires. They're inaccurate
There has
fires.
been more targeted attacks on joint U.S.
But not
Iraqi
successful.
bases.
Not successful attacks.
That's a
Joyce.
different.
You got to kill
conversation.
Americans for us to respond, and they know not to do that.
But to my question, is Iran deterred? Yes or no?
Yes, absolutely.
Then why are they doing more attacks?
They're not doing more attacks. They're doing successful. They're unsuccessful attacks.
Just more than 12 attacks just in the Gulf waters. Today there is a ship, an Iranian ship carrying oil.
But that's not an
That's
attack.
no, that's not an attack, but they are openly and blatantly violating sanctions. So
Right.
when we sit here and argue, from our comfortable spaces that the maximum pressure is working, how is it working when we're seeing, U.S. with its hands tied in the region, and still Iran is operational?
I would love to be Qasem Soleimani or an Iranian general saying, we are winning, this is easy. We got half of the press is on our side, half the American public is on our side, maybe 70%. The Europeans are going to cave. Let's continue to do this and tout it as a success, but it's not a success. They're not successfully doing
It's not a
things.
zero-sum game if Iran is winning or the U.S. is winning.
Yeah.
Is Iran deterred, and is the strategy working? That's where we are. And Brian,
this is where
Behnam,
It's
you
also
can
not
weigh
yet.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, please.
No, you go first.
Please,
Go.
please. No.
This is where I don't
Do 30
see-
seconds to a little quick thing.
30 seconds.
30
Go-
seconds.
Go for it, man.
Successful attacks are destroying militia arms depots in Iraq and Syria. Successful attacks are being able to thwart, shoot down drones and things. Those are successful attacks. Now, Iran has
Tactical,
done things,
right.
but they're not successful attacks. That's the difference.
Brian?
Again, I don't see the rewards of this policy worth the risks that are quite high. I don't see the payoff just yet. And you may be right. I'm skeptical that this Polaroid snapshot of where we are right now may produce something different where Iran does come to the table or they stand back. But to answer your question, I don't see them deterred. I see them provoked. And I think your comments actually indicate that as well, that they are testing the limits and how far they can go. There's a broader field than just sort of the tactical military, because when I look at places, not just Yemen, and you talked about Yemen, where the Houthis, in a sense, have split this coalition the UAE is repositioning itself. I think it's fair to say, vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia. The team that Trump tried to build does not look so cohesive and strong. All of the weapons that we flooded the zone doesn't seem to.
I would draw a line, but in what's happening in Yemen, I mean, you have the dynamics of the conflict. That's one thing.
Yeah.
But you have, I think, if you look across the GCC, there's high anxiety about Iran. There is legitimate security fears that even, the Qatari Emir, when he visited and he's at odds with others, he also talked about it. So there are two fronts in Yemen. Did you reference, when you talk about UAE, Saudi differences, is that about Iran or is that about Yemen?
It's about Yemen, but I also think there's a difference in tone and approach to the fact that the UAE is meeting with representatives from Iran. They have different interests, and it's a quite fractious bunch. But across the region, you mentioned Iraq. But Syria is the biggest place where you see an aggressive appeasement strategy by the Trump administration fully in place. Where Iran, one of the requirements from Secretary Pompeo, is no Iranian presence inside of Syria. I submit to you, as somebody who thinks that it's important for the US to stand by allies like Israel when they're faced with threats, it's shameful that Israel feels the need to conduct regular strikes inside of Syria and now including inside of Iraq, where we have a troop presence. And I'm not saying we should go full-out conventional offensive war with Iran. No, absolutely. I think there'd be a disaster. What I'm saying is that they're playing a multi-level game where they have spread their influence and deepened it in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in places like Yemen, and they're using multiple tools, media, cyber, and other things, to actually punch far above their weight, whereas the US with its allies have all of these conventional tools, and we're not shaping the dynamics to our favor. That's all I'm arguing.
But on Syria, isn't it a bipartisan almost approach that we've seen, continuation from the Obama administration till now to just look the other way? It's not exactly it wasn't a priority for the last administration. It's not a priority for this one.
Absolutely. It was a priority in the sense that the defeat of ISIS was the #1 goal in Syria. And we live now, again, in this haze. This is where we are right now, this political and policy haze where people can just say, we're going to end endless wars as a slogan, and then ignore the facts of terrorist movements like ISIS still having deep roots. There was never any impetus to solve the conflict in Syria as a policy priority. People may have said it, but the #1 goal was the anti-terror objective. And that, I would raise, if ISIS does reemerge as a factor, that was one of the things that led to this tactical cooperation with Iran in places like Iraq in some sort of way. If that emerges again, that places another conundrum for those inside of the Trump administration who are trying to, again, impose maximum pressure against Iranian forces across the theaters.
Sure. I do want to bring in Fatima. Brian mentioned Yemen. If you want to just, take a step back, look at the Iranian role in Yemen. How widespread is it today? Are the Houthis a full Iranian proxy in your opinion? And what are the options for the Gulf countries, for the US?
But I just wanted, there's some interesting things I've heard in the panel, and I would say that Iran has been extremely patient. That's its main strength. And then, yes, it thrives in a symmetrical warfare, not in a conventional one. So it thrives by deploying its militias overseas and creating that threat that it is so difficult for us to respond to, given the fact that it will create so many devastating consequences if you do respond to it conventionally. So, using that patience and using that ability to reassess where it is at every juncture, and it's sort of like not so different with the Iranian crisis, where President Carter has offered, back then, President Carter offered so many deals to Iran, including lifting the sanctions, etc. And Iran decided to wait out and not to negotiate with what they perceived was the losing side. And when Reagan took over, it was within weeks that that crisis resolved. And I think they're doing the same thing again, right? 5 days.
5 minutes.
So, 5 minutes, great, yes. And they're doing the same thing again. They're waiting. And I would say if the maximum pressure campaign is not working, it's partly because of our response and our attitude to it. So how do we really, I see a very divided Europe, but in terms of agreeing with us. And I think perhaps with the way that Iran has behaved in terms of seizing the ships and trying to assert its dominance over the Strait of Hormuz, that the Europeans are finally waking up to see that this is really a dangerous power and it's not behaving rationally. And it's an increasingly tactical power. So in terms of Yemen, I mean, I've written a paper about this. The Yemenis, the Houthis, have been increasingly belligerent about their support to Iran. They haven't been as shy as before, saying no, we have nothing to do with Iran. In fact, it was interesting if we'd say the maximum pressure campaign is working or not, but the Houthis have raised funds from Yemen to actually support Hezbollah, and that was an interesting headline. I mean, if it's anything, it tells me that the maximum pressure campaign is working. And I'll tell you one more thing: Iran had historically only caved in when there was when it saw either a military threat or an economic threat, and that's what happened during the Iraq War.
What do we mean by caved in?
And sort of, this is the only way that you could get Iran
to the table.
Yes,
fundamentally
absolutely.
change a national security prerogative of the Islamic Republic. There's only a handful of times, probably counted on one hand, where they have changed a fundamental national security prerogative. The example par excellence is the Iran-Iraq War. 8-year conflict. If you take snapshots of the conflict, looks like Iran is up and sometimes, down and sometimes, world medicine sometimes, the most backward country in the world and sometimes, depending on how they prosecute that conflict, depending on the strategy at play, depending on the faction in Iran that's ascendant at the time. All these different variables, strategy, ideology, factionalism, drives Iranian foreign policy. So let that conflict be our guide here. That war took 8 years. For 7.5 of the years, Khomeini, devastating for the region.
For Iraq, for Iran, yeah.
Funny though, those who advocate restraint love that war, meaning those in American foreign policy, national security decision-making, who advocate for the policy of restraint and not to be onshore, love that war. So I would use this example to say, no, even policy of restraint has costs. Look at what happened in the region when you totally step back and then you try to play both sides. But anyway, going back to this point, Khomeini, for the 7.5 years of that war, said war, war, war until victory. The idea of regime change in Baghdad is not a Bush administration phenomenon. It was really, it was an article of belief for Ayatollah Khomeini, that you could export the Islamic Revolution to Baghdad. And it is because of that conflict that Iran is forever intervening in Iraqi affairs. They do not ever want a strong, stable neighbor to their west ever again. But because of the way the war went on, because of the string of military successes Iraq had against Iran, because of increasing Western and increasing international involvement, military pressure, economic pressure, Khomeini said that if he had any dignity before God, he bargained it away, and that he likened accepting a UN-mandated ceasefire resolution to drinking from a poison chalice. Now, the entire art for American foreign policy is how do you make Khamenei, Khomeini's successor, drink from the same poison chalice and accept something that he doesn't like. Now, it's going to be very tricky. It's going to take a very, very long time. Max pressure shouldn't be a partisan proposition. It should be driven by this conclusion that Iran only yields when faced with this type of unrelenting pressure, and let Iran make mistakes, right? It was actually Saddam Hussein during the Iran-Iraq War that began to target international shipping. But forever in the historiography of the conflict, we remember Iran is the one using Chinese-supplied cruise missiles and using the fast attack craft and using other boats to harass international shipping.
Do you see any signs?
So just like Iran doing these tanker attacks now, the more they escalate, the more they risk driving Europe towards us. The more they grossly violate the deal, the harder it will be for Europe to say these things are not only violations of the deal, they're violations of Iran's comprehensive safeguard agreements, violations of other international treaties that Iran is a party to. So Iran is in a bind. It has a cap for its escalation. Their strategy was predicated on patience. Our strategy, too, relies on patience. Time is being weaponized by both sides. And the question is the U.S. policy going to be fundamentally based on sanctions alone, or is it going to have something else? That's why I mentioned for max pressure to be truly successful, to get Iran to the table, you need a regional component and you need a diplomatic component, because Iran felt isolated at the tail end of the Iran-Iraq war.
But
Iran doesn't necessarily feel isolated
today. Are there
today.
any signs that the regime internally is about to cave in?
Zarif came to the States twice in 2019, if I'm not mistaken. Each time he floated a prisoner swap once. He floated the idea of missile talks even. So yes, Iran is negotiating publicly. That's a measure of max success. Iran's red lines from really April, May until now for negotiations have changed. They say multiple different things. They say we will only negotiate with America if they return to the JCPOA. We will only negotiate if they remove the oil waiver. We will only negotiate if we're treated with respect. Well, which one is it? This country is publicly negotiating now. We should see this as a public measure of their negotiations. And like any country, like North Korea, another nuclear rogue, they are doing military things to build leverage for when they come to the table.
Mike, to Fatima's point, you know, the waiting it out, the Carter-Reagan analogy during the hostage crisis, do you see it an option now for Iran? And how do you see the calculus inside Iran, inside the Iranian regime?
Well, the pro-JCPOA crowd is telling the regime to wait it out, to wait for 2020. But when you hear the nuanced language coming out of some of the Democratic candidates for the presidency, they're concerned about sunset clauses. They're concerned about ballistic missiles. They're concerned about Iran's supporting terrorism. These things are not in the JCPOA, but they think they should be in a renegotiated JCPOA, so that's a good sign. Can the regime survive another 14 months of maximum pressure? Yes. But will it hurt them? Yes. Can they survive Trump being reelected and continuing this for another 4 years? I don't think so. But again, to Brian's point—
you mean, can you explain what you mean by—
Well, I mean, the Iranian people are the loudest voice here. Now, I've never been to Iran. I've asked to go, for the record, and they've said no. And I'd probably end up in Evin prison. I probably wouldn't come back. But I'd write a really interesting book if I survived it. And, you know, the whole thing is, if you listen to the diaspora, if you listen to Iranians, if you look at simply the hijab movement, the regime is in trouble. The regime is in trouble, and the only thing the United States can do is mess it up. We shouldn't get involved. We should keep up the maximum pressure campaign. The supreme leader, I'm told, when I visit the region, I visited some of our regional allies' intelligence directors, and they said the supreme leader gets a brief every morning, and in that brief is the price of eggs, the price of chickens, right there with the status of militias in the region. That's telling. You know, the equivalent, imagine making $6,000 a year and then paying $6 an egg. That's what Iran is if you have a job. That's huge. That's a big deal. It's 6 cents an egg here in the United States. My point is it's working, and my faith in consistency in foreign policy and my faith in something that Brian said, it's right. It's an aggressive appeasement. One day you're like, yeah, that's right. The next day you're like, what are you saying? You know, what are you doing? Just one quick point, and then I'll stop and I won't talk anymore. We're bound to mess this up. So I think we shouldn't, and that's why I have Brian here, because I think in the next administration, Brian's going to be a key voice in any National Security Council, inshallah, hopefully. But we need to get back.
Appropriate use of inshallah.
We need to get back to a bipartisan approach to our adversaries and stop the whataboutism arguments. Anytime you talk about the Islamic Republic, it'd be nice to have a conversation about the Islamic Republic instead of always saying, what about Saudi Arabia?
So let it be known that I've got the ever-important Michael Pregent endorsement for a Democratic administration.
Yes.
Can I just say—
It's intentional. I'm derailing you.
On maximum pressure, again, I'm against it. I think it's put us in a weaker position and a much more precarious position. But if you're going to put pressure, and there is hurt and cost on Iran, I want to know what next. The reason I said this policy is confusing allies and dividing ourselves is that I actually don't see a figment of what the next step is, and we're doing it at a time when there's likely at some point in the next few years to be a leadership transition. I'm such a great analyst that I can look at actuarially tables and predict that the supreme leader probably won't be with us at some point in the next 5 to 10 years, maybe sooner. And our current approach, I don't see a glide path to how do we use then what's our diplomacy with allies in the world, that P5+1 plus partners in the region, nor the politics at home, which I just think is,
Brian,
to actually build a consensus here in America that Mike talks about in a general way, easier said than done when our foreign policy debate has become so predictable that I think artificial intelligence and algorithms could actually replace a lot of us because, there's this less filling tastes great notion of most national security and foreign policy debates these days. Which I hope we're not doing here. I don't think we are. But go ahead, Joyce.
But when you're watching I assume you're watching the Democratic debates, and when at least you have 20 out of 24 candidates who agree to go back to the deal, to the nuclear deal, isn't that a signal for Iran? Just
well, yeah.
For us, and is that a realistic goal when you look at the sunset clause, when you look at the arms embargo and other stuff that is on its way to expiring? So
it's a signal of a certain perspective, but as Mike said, there's nuance there. It depends on the candidate and what's going on, and I fully appreciate politics. I get it. I was a guy who wrote proposals a decade plus ago about ending the war in Iraq, right? And believed in some of those, and then it was used politically. But as Mike said, there's more nuance there once you get the job, if you get it. What I see, and back to sort of the political point here, is there's much more nuance among Democratic voters about Iran. We did this study, people can come get a copy of it, America Adrift, about public attitudes on a range of foreign policy questions. And on Iran, people don't like maximum pressure. About a third of Trump's base support it. Voters. The rest are in favor of some sort of diplomatic approach with a strong backing for it. Other findings, we asked people, what do you think of Iran among a number of different countries? Is it a friend, ally? Is it an enemy? Or is it a competitor? 71% of Americans say it's an enemy. That, I think, is the product of a lot of propaganda, Iran's own actions, and things like this. There is maximum space to create what Mike talks about, some sort of bipartisan consensus to deal with Iran in the full spectrum. Trump didn't happen to use that approach. Trump's modus operandi, actually every day with his own party, with other countries like Denmark, is to divide and fragment, but not divide and conquer. We don't succeed. And I don't think we have a formula coming in the reaction from a lot of people where it's this less filling tastes great, JCPOA is great, go back to it, or maximum pressure. There's actually a lot of room between the two to build a consensus with allies and here at home is what I'm saying.
I want to go to Fatima to just weigh in on, when you look at the Gulf countries, when you look at the current tension, what options do they have given, the Trump administration is increasing sanctions, is putting measures in place, but when Iran shut down a U.S. drone, there was no military response that some actually had anticipated. So how did that change the dynamic, and where do you see the Gulf countries today?
The Gulf countries today are in a really weak position, and part of it is because there's this international reluctance in terms of what to do with Iran, how to respond, and there isn't any, unified objective or a vision. People don't even know, if people thought that Iran is an enemy, people don't even know what Saudi Arabia or UAE is, whether it's a friend or a foe. So there's a significant problem there. And insofar that also the policy analysts around Yemen usually underplay the Iranian role in supporting the Houthis, which I feel has been a reason for so many policy errors when it comes to Yemen. And so the only way that I feel that we can abandon a military solution in Yemen and pursue a more reasonable diplomatic solution is if we really pressure the Iranian regime somehow. And I feel like Trump can really have a victory in Yemen if he decides to focus on bringing an end to that conflict. But it's as we're talking about all of this, I mean, I think that thinking about Iran and the role of its militias overseas, we rarely talk about the human cost of these militias in the respective countries. So in Yemen, a big part of the humanitarian catastrophe is driven because of the Houthis' behavior. And the Houthis have no incentive to negotiate. And in fact, Iran has scuttled the negotiations and coming to an agreement in the peace talks in Kuwait in 2017 and continues to do so until today. So until there is real pressure on Iran and a strategy, I mean, I'm quite disappointed to see that this democratic upset over the Iranian deal is just taking place without really addressing what are the challenges in the Iranian deal that have led us to reconsider. So the use of the militias, the ballistic missiles that are there, I mean, these are the components that I would like to see the Democratic candidates address. So, we don't want to see a continuation of Iran's behavior. I was recently in an academic conference where, I was really struck because there were so many Europeans and others who were saying that Iran has really no choice but to use militias, because that's a defensive strategy. It's not an offensive strategy. And frankly, that's quite ridiculous. I mean, Iran has a choice to de-escalate. It's feeling threatened for a reason. It's feeling threatened because of its behavior overseas. And it's feeling threatened because it's directly challenging our interests overseas. So, instead of, there's a way to include Iran. I mean, I'd like to pursue that if there's a way to include Iran. But
don't you have to, given their leverage now in Yemen?
Of course. I mean, I think I would not like to see Yemen become as complicated as Syria, for example, where there are so many players in the mix, and it's spoiled Syria. But I think that, in Yemen, the situation, we cannot just talk about Houthis independently of Iran, which is what all of the analysts have been saying. And we cannot, in considering the human cost of the conflict, you really have to understand what Iran has been doing in the country. So again, one of the examples that I give to people is the child soldiers that are in Yemen. So there is enforced conscription of kids of 8 years and older, and these are forced to fight. And I'll use a Game of Thrones analogy. I think that Abdul Malik al-Houthi and Iran would be happy to burn Yemen down if they could be the king of the ashes. So that's the issue. Iran is so content on winning, and it's what it wants, that it's ready to basically overlook the cost of the humanitarian suffering. And the irony is that if you read every paper out there, it tells you that it's the Americans' responsibility and it's the Gulf responsibility. And I think we are unfairly taking the wrong or an unfair share of the burden.
Since we're really getting to the point where we'll have to turn to the audience, but I do want to ask you a final question. If you were to predict, between now and the U.S. elections, do you see either a Pompeo-Zarif meeting or a Trump-Rouhani meeting, perhaps? We have the UN General Assembly coming up, so just very quickly, yes or no?
I think it would be a mistake to do anything that legitimizes the regime, but possibly it'll happen.
Possibly.
Yes, unless I can change minds.
Fatima.
So yes.
I think Iran will wait it out for the next elections.
So no meeting.
It's a no for now. Yeah.
I think yes, there'll be a meeting, because contrary to the view of Iran waiting it out, I think if Iran did a complete assessment of the Trump administration and President Trump himself and how he's acted on North Korea, yes, he'd want to get a Republican president to get a deal that is sort of like his NAFTA deal, which is not all that different. JCPOA won't be all that different. It'll just have Trump's name on it. And the Republican Party today, sorry, my own political comment, will just go along with whatever Trump says. And that's a better, more sustainable framework from Iran's perspective. As one Middle East official once told me, they saw in Trump a man who's easily flattered, so we're going to flatter him. So I predict that there'll be a meeting, Iran will flatter him, and that'll happen before November of 2020.
But this is the limits of politics and ascendancy of ideology, because Khamenei right now will not engage with Trump. Unlike North Korea and Turkey, which when the Trump administration came into office,
is who we're talking about.
yeah, but Khamenei has to give the green light.
Right.
But unlike North Korea and Turkey, which when Trump came into office sought to divide Trump from the administration and the rest of his base, Iran until April, May of this year really sought to lump Trump in with the American problem. Say Trump is the manifestation of American hubris, and that's why they had this rejectionist stance. Now maybe they're peeling away a little bit. I actually think they're trying to rope-a-dope some of the GCC states. You know, there was this Zarif talking about the 4 Bs, Bolton, Bibi, bin Zayed, bin Salman. Zarif and Rouhani are trying to play up the president's deal-making instincts, and my concern is actually none of this escalation. My concern is what happens if the US goes for premature diplomacy as opposed to productive diplomacy. The goal is you want a bigger, broader, better deal. I'm all for that. You can use pressure for that. You can play chicken and then swerve at the last minute. My 2 cents to the president would be simply, don't swerve yet, because what all this escalation is designed to do, remember I said it has limited military utility. It's a political strategy. It's designed to get America to slow the pace of the sanctions, which are effective, to cease the enforcement, which is effective, and to roll back the sanctions, which again is effective, and then to incentivize America to come to the table with this political consideration in mind of a la North Korea, Hanoi, Helsinki, and to get something that isn't bigger, that isn't broader, that isn't better, but is just a new deal. So they're trying to incentivize premature diplomacy.
No meeting. What's
No meeting.
no meeting?
No meeting.
Okay. Well, with that, we're gonna go to the Q&A. Please make sure you have a question. Why don't we start here with Ibn Nasser, my colleague at Sky News. And if you can mention who you want to address your question to.
Thank you, Joyce. My question is for Brian. Yeah, it's said that the maximum pressure campaign is not working.
Yeah.
Was that working? How?
Was the nuclear deal working?
Yes.
It was working according to the terms that were defined in the
Switch on her mic for me, real quick.
So was the nuclear deal working or
or
not?
not?
Yeah, the question
to
is
Brian.
whether the 2015 nuclear deal was working or not. And I would say it was working according to the terms that were negotiated and agreed upon by P5+1 and Iran. It did have weaknesses, as we've all pointed out. And one of the biggest weaknesses, which I agree with, was Iran's actions in the region, destabilizing neighboring countries. There were efforts that were fitful. Obama invited the leaders of the GCC to Camp David in 2015 for a bunch of working groups. There wasn't anything in terms of a real strategy. Similarly, under Trump, this notion of an Arab NATO, I mean, you cover the region. Tell me how that's working out these days. Maybe it's going to be revived recently. So there were weaknesses in it. My point is that there was a better pathway, both here at home and then in the world, to actually strengthen the agreement and address Iran's destabilizing actions. We happen to have not chosen the strongest pathway to do that. We've confused and divided our allies in the world, and then a little bit in the region, as you understand. We've divided ourselves even more, because everything, of course, today is a partisan wedge issue. The incentives for left and right, and Democrats and Republicans to go after each other on tough issues like Iran are so much stronger than trying to actually find a policy that would be stronger for America and for countries in the region. So, but to answer your question, yes, the deal was working according to the terms that was agreed upon, and it could have been improved upon over the last 2 or 3 years. We just happened to choose a pathway that puts us on a riskier escalation to war and has weakened some of our partners in the region.
But just 1 minute. If the United States didn't withdraw from the deal, do you think at 2020 the United States would be able, and the world would be able to contain Iran, or at 2023?
It's such a hypothetical, but again, my diagnostic is sort of unity at home, unity of purpose. And this is not a new thing. Trump is the apotheosis of this, right? This division within our own country on tough issues. I'm not optimistic because as the reference to Iraq in the 2003 war, it's like it's not even apples and oranges to compare what's going on with Iran right now. It's like apples and bicycles. It's like two different things. On Iraq, there was actually this consensus.
I was talking about the Iran-Iraq war.
Yeah, sorry. 2003. There was a bipartisan consensus to go in there, which was a huge mistake strategically and has gotten us to where we are right now. Today, we're in a much riskier environment where Trump essentially has fragmented himself, even with his own party, on things like Saudi issues. And we don't actually have that unity that is required of a democracy to address tough, complicated national security questions like Iran. So my biggest fear is that we'll actually become even less and less of a factor. You have think tank analysts from left and right basically saying, let's leave it alone. Let's step back from the region. And that, I think, is going to make things even more complicated in the region.
Okay, why don't we go to the back? Gentleman in the glasses, yeah.
And the guy in front of him with the mustache.
Thank you. This is Stanley Kober, former Hudson. I'm looking at an op-ed that just appeared in the Jordan Times. The American hegemony in the Middle East has come to an end, it argues. With President Trump's failure to check Iran...
Your question, there's no need
I'll get to the question.
Thank you.
This realization has become commonplace. Far from being omnipotent, the United States is now impotent. If the maximum pressure campaign is working, why does an analysis like this appear in the Jordan Times?
Do you have...
Is it working?
I mean, this is... I think we've addressed this. There's different views on the panel on whether the maximum pressure is working or not. And
he's a former Hudson guy. Let me give him a little bit of a respect and give him an answer. or I might not have a job after this. Like, all right, so anyway, what I would say is the maximum pressure campaign is focused on Iran. It is working. Does it stabilize Iraq? No. Does it stabilize Syria? No. Does it stabilize Yemen? No. But Iran's victories are in fractured countries. Iraq is fractured. Syria is fractured. Yemen's fractured. The pressure is to lessen the ability of Iran to further fracture these countries. Are we successful? No, we're not successful because every 2 years we change out the strategy. It's kind of a Redskin analogy, actually. We run wars like Daniel Snyder runs the Redskins. We change out the team every year, host for a Super Bowl, we never get there. So we need a Belichick strategy, and the country won't have one unless we have a bipartisan approach to our adversaries.
And whether or not it's appeared in the Jordan Times, I mean, why not? It's a newspaper. So maybe we go, actually, let's go to the gentleman with the mustache.
Once upon a time in Washington, D.C.
I'm so glad I decided to grow this yesterday. At first, just really quick, big kudos to, my name is Guy Taylor. I'm the national security editor at the Washington Times newspaper. Big kudos to Hudson Institute for supporting a panel with such a diversity of views. This is pretty rare these days, and it's so important. I think a lot of people here know that. With regard to the reports this morning of another downed U.S. drone in Yemen, for Behnam, perhaps, or Fatima, would your assessment be that this is something the Iranians likely ordered, or is it something that the Houthis would have likely done on their own? The second thing, really quick, and I think this was addressed a bit, Brian, you just mentioned Arab NATO, but I'm hoping to hear a little bit more from any of you on it. There's this critique right now that says the administration is sort of abandoning the 79-nation Obama-era counter-ISIS coalition and trying to essentially twist it into a counter-Iran coalition. Is that really what's happening? And what are the potential pitfalls or perhaps benefits from such an approach? Thanks for calling on me.
So Fatima, why don't...
I mean, it could have been down by Iran themselves or by IRGC operatives in Yemen. All of the Houthis' capabilities have come from Hezbollah or Iran. So They are shooting at whatever they perceive as a threat that is logical. They control the territory in the north, and they're going to continue to do so. I would go back to the Aramco attack that occurred last week, in which maybe the Houthis claimed 10 drones have landed into Saudi Arabia, where it actually was able to destroy a small part of the plant in Aramco, and had they hit an explosive part of the plant, that could have been really devastating. There are not only Saudi workers in the plant, but also American workers, and it's really devastating. I mean, again, I was in the company with some Yemeni people who were telling me, we wish Americans died. That way America could take this seriously and understand that the Houthis are a real threat to deal with. So why do we have to wait until it escalates and we, find American blood on the Houthis' hand for us to respond? We need to find a way to pressure Iran to behave and to pressure the Houthis. And to this, I want to just mention quickly that the UN envoy could take a much stronger stance in holding Houthis accountable for their intransigence in the region. So it's not just merely a Yemen conflict, civil war, but using this to clearly help Iran gain more leverage is devastating, and the UN needs to act on this.
On the Arab NATO,
A
if we
footnote
can,
to Fatima.
very quickly, and then
footnote,
because there are many questions.
A, nice mustache. B, it was reported that it was down with an SA-6 SAM. So really, this is an empirical question. Go back to your Jane's books. Go back to your IIS books. Did Saleh have the SA-6 SAM? And if he did have it, then clearly it's not Iran provided. Trust me, there's plenty of things in Yemen that Iran has provided, but let's not forget Yemen was divided during the Cold War. It's awash in Soviet, Russian, Chinese, and North Korean weaponry. Many of the missiles are Iranian, but there's things that the Houthis themselves have reverse engineered from air to air to surface to air. There's things the Iranians have helped them get from surface to air to surface to surface. So if it is true that it's the SA-6, then we just have to look, did Saleh have the SA-6? Because the Houthis now have Saleh's arsenal. And
it was still an IRGC proxy that launched it. So
also,
we're gonna put that in place.
Yeah.
The entity that did it doesn't matter who owns it.
It's easy to label me a big hawk on Iran, and I am, but this is where history matters. The Houthis are not a proxy yet. They're a full-blown partner. This is the Iran hawk saying this, because the more you kind of say that they're a full-blown proxy already, then you risk any way to kind of split the Houthis or to have any kind of piecemeal attempt to solve Yemen that doesn't involve Iran. The Houthis, they had a nationalist insurgency since the 90s, since the country in Yemen was united. They're going to have grievances. There were Houthis, there were Zaydis in the Arabian Peninsula ever before there was an Islamic Republic to be conceived of.
Sure, it's not a monolith. I agree with you. It's not a monolith, but at the same time, there are ideological links that go far back with the founder of the movement.
Strategically aligned.
And they're strategically aligned. And I just want to
absolutely, but just let's be very careful. That's why the visit to Tehran matters so much, because there's a Houthi spokesperson who went to Tehran saying he recognizes Khamenei's walaya, his guardianship.
Go get him.
This is new, right? If they were a full-blown proxy from years ago, this statement would not be new. This is new. So the longer the conflict continues, the more we drive them into Iran's hands.
But I'd add to this, the Houthis even see themselves right now as axes of resistance.
Yeah, that's right.
The same language that Hezbollah is using and everybody is using.
That's right.
But if you even look at the origin of it, the emblem is the same. The way that they go on TV,
they kill
is
Baha'is.
Similar.
Yeah,
No, but even Hussein Badruddin al-Houthi, who started this movement, wouldn't have taken this turn from the movement of the believing youth, which was a theological
90s,
movement, if he did not visit Iran, if Iran was not invested in him.
Yeah, Iran is co-opting a nationalist movement.
Yes, but I would just recommend reading the paper that I wrote on
Yes.
I will read it, and I would recommend reading a testimony I did last September, which is when you're looking at Iran's proxy strategy in the region, because it's easy to call everything a proxy, right? If you're looking at men, that's Iranian. Money, that's Iranian. Munitions, that's Iranian. These are the vectors. These are the vectors of influence.
Another
of Iran
panel,
in the
maybe
region.
next week.
But so Iran
we
creates
see you all
groups like
again here.
Hezbollah, and then Iran co-opts
Oh,
groups like
we
that.
still got
But
It's
we
important to
still
know
have
these
many
differences.
questions, Behnam. To your question, though, about the Arab NATO, I hate to see it being ignored. I mean, it's not entirely a new idea. I happen to have been assigned the story for like 7, 8, 9, 10 times. It started in 1953, and then the Obama administration also attempted. It hasn't worked. Egypt has recently withdrawn itself, and that being the biggest troop force, it definitely throws a wrench into the whole concept. And they haven't agreed actually on a concept yet, but there'll be another meeting coming up where you should read our coverage. But to go to, maybe we go to this side of the audience, to go Mona Shikaki in the pink with Al-Arabiya.
Thank you. I have a question about what you're talking about, whether the strategy is working or not, but what is the end goal? You listen to the administration and it seems like there are different end goals. Sometimes Trump talks about he just doesn't want them to get a nuclear weapon. And then you hear Pompeo, he talks about the intervention in different places and the 13 lists. And then you hear reporting about Bolton and he says he just doesn't like the whole regime because you can't really change the regime's pattern of behavior. You just need to change the regime as a whole. So, I mean, what is the end goal and how realistic is it? And it would just be great if I had like somebody like Brian to tell me that, even from the, what would the, a Democratic administration's end goal be? And then, either Michael or Behnam on the other side.
Okay.
If Behnam answers, then we'll go to 12:30 on that. But, no, I'm just kidding.
Only because you skipped him during 11:30.
Okay. Anyway, go ahead.
I honestly, I'm not being snarky here, is I don't know the exact precise end goal of this administration because there's so many statements that are across the map. When I said confusing allies, that's based on talking to my research of countries that want to see a more assertive approach against Iran but aren't sure that there's actual plan. Trump's a man without a plan. Is a deep concern. What the ideal would be is an approach that actually introduces more stability in the region and takes ideas like Joyce has reported on the Arab NATO failing multiple times. I wrote a paper on it for the Century Foundation. It's not a bad idea. It's just hard to implement against the realities of a region that's quite fractured. It's an excellent idea for an America that actually wants to right-size its approach to the Middle East. Easier said than done. But an approach that actually makes sure that all the pathways that Iran has to a nuclear weapon are cut off, that actually deals with the destabilizing actions of Iran, as well as other countries in the region, some of our closest partners, that have undermined the stability of the state system in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria. A platonic ideal that's different than Mike Pompeo's 12 or 13 requirements, but it's one that actually I think is a more sensible approach that needs more than just a military approach and aggressive rhetoric or different speeches or the same old agreement from 2015.
Just a quick 20 seconds on this. 17 seconds, Roger. All right, so it's regime change without saying regime change. If you look at the 12 points, Iran doesn't have to adhere to all 12. If they adhere to 3 of those, the regime collapses. If they adhere to 2 of them, the regime collapses. The 12 steps that Pompeo has laid out are by design made to be something the regime can't accept. If you look at any of those 12, take any combination, the regime would collapse if it accepted any of them. So I think it's regime change without saying it. Again, doesn't mean it's going to happen. We're not good at this. We don't know how to do this right. And the best thing we can do is have hands off.
Why you say that? I wondered.
Roger. So the other thing is the Iranian people are blaming the regime for sanctions and not the Americans. And I'm not talking about the pro-regime Iranians. I'm talking about the people that are complaining about eggs and chickens. Are blaming the regime for squandering the economic opportunities of the JCPOA. But they want to see a strategy behind it. And they believe the strategy is regime change without saying regime change. So that's the strategy that Iranians are hoping we have. We're saying it without saying it, and we're bound to mess it up.
Okay. Mona, does that answer? We'll go to the lady in the front.
Do you want me to take over? Do you have to go?
Hi, Sarah Stern, the Endowment for Middle East Truth. I'd like to hear from other people besides Brian about whether or not they really believe the JCPOA was working. It seems like everybody puts the onus on President Trump for leaving the JCPOA, but there were certain provisions of the JCPOA that the Iranians were great at cheating at, such as military sites were supposed to be open to the IAEA, and the IAEA, for some reason, did not go in, and we found out that they were actually enriching uranium there. And of course, if I were, an Iranian regime, I would use the military sites. So what are other people's views about the JCPOA working?
So what was the JCPOA working or not? Very quickly though, so we can get.
It was working for Iran very well, and they messed it up. And President Obama was right. He said Iran would never get a bomb on my watch, and then he left office 12 months later. So it was working.
Any other views?
Sure. So, in short, JCPOA is a low bar to say you've kind of sealed off all the pathways for Iran to get a nuclear weapon. In essence, there are even times when the JCPOA, which we know was heavily slanted in Iran's favor, Iran did things that pushed the limit. Twice, it violated the heavy water caps, the tonnage limit. It also did things that are violations of Annex B of UN Security Council Resolution 2231. This is really the only thing that codifies and enshrines the deal at the international level. In Annex B, there's the injunction that calls upon Iran not to flight test missiles. There's the arms transfer, of course, injunction, which we know Iran is grossly violating with the stuff they sent to Yemen, across the region. There's also a UN blacklist travel ban. Soleimani's not supposed to travel. You see him take selfies in Iraq and Syria all the time. And of course, there's entities on this blacklist like Defense Industries Organization, a subsidiary of Iran's defense industry, that appears at Iraqi military arms expos next to American and British arms contractors. And really, it's supposed to have its assets frozen and visa revoked.
Is Iran today closer to a nuclear weapon than it was under the...
Iran is beginning to violate the tenets in the JCPOA. It's not making the dash that would make it so close, but it's beginning to put a knife to one of the key achievements of the throat of the JCPOA, which is a one-year breakout. So by beginning to grow its capacity and quality and quantity of its centrifuges, it can shorten that timeline and then make itself closer. But it's incrementally doing this because it's trying to keep both sides of the Atlantic apart for now.
If we can go here, the gentleman with the redskins.
Wait, take the mic away from me.
Good afternoon to Michael and to Brian. Like I say, a defiant hail to the Redskins. And to Fatima, Joyce, and Behnam, I'll say a more diplomatic sabakher chitore.
Thank you.
Anyways, my name's Chris Orr, former Air Force officer, former DHS, and oh, by the way, former contractor at Balad Air Base, where I had my own fair share of personal encounters with the PMUs. That said, NFL rivalry aside, I guess I'll direct my question toward Brian. We know about the Iranians' military. I'm sorry, Brian. Sorry, Mike. Didn't mean to. I mean you like that compared to an Eagles fan, but
anytime you can tie me to Brian is a good thing.
Sorry, didn't mean to cuss you out like that. And if you are a Cowboys fan, anyways. NFL rivalries aside, we know about Iran's military capabilities to attack, commercial shipping vessels. That said, if the proverbial turds hit the fan, we do end up in a conventional shooting war with Iran. How are their capabilities as far as threatening our naval assets, particularly our carriers and our submarines?
If they take a first strike capability, and I'll defer to Ben on this, they will be able to inflict some damage. Hopefully there's enough of a deterrent in place to prevent that from happening. But at any time, we could simply decimate the IRGC Navy. But what happens then? And that's the calculus. The conventional war will be a naval one. It won't be a land force, a ground force one. There will be no invasion of Iran. There will be no 100,000 American troops on the ground. We're just not good at those things. It'll be a naval confrontation, at which if they have a first strike, we'll incur some losses, and then we'll decimate it. And then everything will be a calculated measured response based on what they're doing, measured response based on what they're doing.
But do you see, this president especially doing anything?
I like that there's a team of rivals within the national security discussions, within the administration. There's a team of rivals. As Brian said, they all disagree. I think that's a good thing. The Washington Post made the mistake of actually making President Trump look like the adult in the room, trying to calm down Bolton. Hey, Bolton, take it easy. We don't want to do this. I think it's great. I think these cyber attacks that the U.S. has put has used against Iran are huge, and no one's talking about those. Those are offensive capabilities. Those are militarized, strategic, pinpoint, surgical, combining those things. Those were very successful.
We're going to go to the gentleman with the white shirt.
Thank you. I'm Simon Marison. I'm with the Wisconsin Project on Nuclear Arms Control. I have a question for Michael. You mentioned that you have faith in consistent foreign policy, I believe in the context of continuing...
I have no faith in U.S. consistent foreign policy is what I meant to say.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Okay, well, in any case, I...
No, but you can ask your question. I'll just give you the opposite answer.
Yeah. Well, as I understood it, in any case, in continuing the maximum pressure campaign from this point forward to have a more consistent policy, what do you think the U.S. decision to withdraw from the JCPOA says to Iran about American foreign policy? How does that change their calculations in their willingness to negotiate with us in the future?
Well, I think withdrawing from the JCPOA did not isolate the U.S. It further isolated Iran. It strengthened our position with North Korea because all you have to do is listen to the words of Senator Schumer. Any nuclear deal with North Korea must address regional behavior, must address ballistic missiles, must not have sunset clauses, must allow all military sites to be inspected by Americans. The JCPOA did not allow Americans or Canadians in to inspect because as Americans travel to the Middle East, we either say from Canada or Texas. That's the safe way to travel to the Middle East. Anyway, I think it was the right thing to do to walk away from the JCPOA. Everyone knows now that in a future negotiation with Iran, it needs to pass the Senate with 60 votes. It needs to be a treaty. So the next president can't just walk in and tear it up. I think the JCPOA was a very weak attempt to constrain Iran, and Iran had everything that would benefit them. If they stayed in if the JCPOA continued and we were still in it, by the second term of Kamala Harris, Iran would be able to put a nuclear warhead on a ballistic missile and be in compliance with this JCPOA. And everybody says, that's not true, Mike, that's not true. I said, tell me why. And then Rob Malia say, because Iran's going to renegotiate the Iran deal in 2028. Like, why would they come back to us and concede when they've got everything they wanted? When they were an economic power, a conventional military power, and now a nuclear power. It's exactly what they wanted to be. And they're not going to be now because we walked out of the JCPOA.
They might acquire a nuclear weapon anyway.
Yeah, but the Russians and the Chinese are not going to allow the Islamic Republic to have a nuclear weapon.
So this is the deterrence you
feel? The NPT is strong enough to deter Iran from a nuclear weapon. What we need to talk about is ballistic missiles. We need to talk about regional behavior. I would love it. I mean, just think about this. If the Supreme Leader issued a decree that we will never weaponize, we will never make a nuclear weapon. Does anybody here believe that? No one believes it. And that should be enough, right? But it's not. I mean, it's a strategy to obtain one.
We really are short on time. I'm sorry. You can maybe
afterwards,
chat with Mike afterwards. Very approachable guy. We're going to go here.
Thank you very much. Michael Kurtzig, who worked on Iran for many years in the Department of Agriculture. One subject is dear and near to our heart is Israel. Have the sanctions, in fact, and the pressure on Iran increased the danger to Israel? And I say that in the context of the proxy war of Hezbollah and Hamas. Does that really increase the danger, and does that mean Israel will react even more? Because we hear threats all the time, wipe us off the map, wipe us off the map. That's not going to happen.
I'm going to throw this to Brian after I answer 20 seconds. The thing about Lebanese Hezbollah wants no part of this. And we've seen it in their rhetoric. We've seen it in their actions. They want no part of this Iranian-U.S. conflict. Now, they're happy to do it later on at a different time when it deals directly with Israel-Hezbollah tensions. But they're not willing to do it. That's why we've seen Lebanese Hezbollah actually tell the Israelis, it wasn't us that launched that rocket. It was those guys, the Iraqi militias in Syria. That's huge. Nasrallah lost a lot of faith amongst his followers based on the sacrifices in Syria to prop up Assad. He cares about what the Lebanese people think of him. He's not ready to go into a war with the United States and Israel when Iran's logistical land bridge, they can't support it, they can't defend it, and they can't keep it from getting hit. I'll throw it to Brian.
First, thanks for your service in the Ag Department, you said. Appreciate it. Yeah, unfortunately, that's an aside, but an important one.
Only at the Hudson Institute.
And I mean, not apropos to your question, but on Israel, I think it's really unfortunate the sort of statements we saw from President Trump yesterday, as I believe sort of trying to make support or the U.S.-Israel relationship a partisan wedge issue. People have been doing this for years. I saw his statement as sort of the investment that those people, I think, are doing a very bad thing, have paid off, and it's bad for Israel and it's bad for the U.S. I did an article late 2017 with a colleague of mine at the time, an Israeli counterterror expert. We went to Israel and talked to security experts there, and they were deeply concerned about the changing and fragmenting landscape in Syria, in Lebanon, and now, I think, in recent briefings inside of Iraq. And this is, again, where I go back to, and we use phrases. I use the aggressive appeasement one. Sorry, it's aimed to get an attention. There's a deeper analysis there. And it's one in which a top Israeli official once said to me that we used to fear our neighbors' strength. We were invaded and had wars with our neighbors. Now we fear their weakness. And the chaos and instability in places like Syria, which we don't even talk about these days as much as we should. The fragmentation in a place like Lebanon, that Joyce knows very well, has been more adeptly exploited by countries like Iran. And what I said briefly, which is a longer, deeper discussion, their use of the multiple tools of statecraft to expand their influence. They've got a long game. We've got games that go every 2 or 4 year electoral cycles. Inside of Israel, they're doing what they can in a shifting landscape against sort of the threats that they see that Iran backs. So I don't think it's in a much better situation. The sort of mutual deterrence that we've seen in place on its northern border since 2006, I think is eroding. But at this point, the erratic nature of the US national security debate and under this president, I think Israel, like many countries in the region, are trying to do what they can on its own with some support whenever it can get it.
Well, on that note, we conclude our, I have to say, very exciting panel. Thank you to our audience. Thank you, C-SPAN. Thank you for the Hudson Institute. And hope we continue the conversation another time.
Thank you for doing this. Thank you, Joyce.